Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. Ketamine is an anesthetic used in clinical settings, but more and more it's being prescribed off-label as a treatment for chronic pain and mental health issues. Dr. Caleb Alexander returns to the podcast to talk about what we know about the safety and effectiveness of ketamine's off-label use and how it's being marketed. Let's listen. Caleb Alexander, welcome back to Public Health on Call. So usually when we have you on, we're talking about opioids, but today we're going to talk about another controlled substance, ketamine. And I think ketamine landed on a lot of people's radars recently when it was revealed that the actor Matthew Perry died from acute effects of ketamine. And we don't know the specific circumstances there, but it is being talked about a lot now that it's being used for mental health treatment. So you've done some research in this area. Tell us a little bit about what is ketamine.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me and for spending a little bit of time on this. Ketamine is an NMDA antagonist, so it blocks a particular neurotransmitter in the brain. And interestingly, there's a fairly rich history of the development of these types of products. In fact, the first was PCP, which everybody knows is an illicit drug, but not one that's certainly not prescribed or dispensed in modern healthcare systems. And while it was developed as an anesthetic in the 1950s, its potency and its dissociative properties, in other words, causing people to feel like they were outside of themselves, essentially led to its abandonment. And ketamine was a follow-up to PCP, was sort of a cousin of PCP, and was developed in the 1960s and used as a battlefield anesthetic in the Vietnam War, and also used clinically in healthcare settings. But I would say the settings where ketamine was developed and was historically used were highly regulated and supervised, inpatient healthcare facilities. We'll get to this, I know, but not how ketamine is being used in 2024.
That was actually going to be my next question before we get to the off-label uses. How is it, I guess, on-label being used today?
Yeah, well, so ketamine, I mentioned PCP, and then I talked about ketamine being developed in the 1960s. And there's one other actor in this play that is also important to mention, which is S-ketamine or Spravato. And so ketamine and S-ketamine are chemically very similar, but they're two different molecules. They're two different drugs. We have ketamine that was developed and is only FDA approved as an anesthetic and is still used widely for anesthesia and for acute pain in surgical settings, operative settings, emergency trauma settings, and the like. And then S-ketamine, this last one that I mentioned, was brought to market, around 2018, 2019, for the management of treatment refractory depression. So you have essentially these two different drugs, ketamine and S-ketamine, that are FDA approved for very different things. You have ketamine that's FDA approved for anesthesia and the like, and then you have S-ketamine, which is approved for the management of treatment refractory depression. Most of what we're hearing about in the news and reading about, and most of what people are talking about is ketamine, the anesthetic that now is being used for many more things than just acute or operative pain and the like.
Well, let's talk about some of those things. How is ketamine being used, as we say, off-label?
Yeah, well, in lots of ways. I mean, to some degree, this is the wild, wild west when you start looking at how ketamine has been marketed and promoted. And there's an interesting loophole in the laws governing marketing and promotion that we can talk about. But suffice it to say that ketamine is now marketed for the management of any number of different psychiatric illnesses. So depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and chronic pain are the biggies. But it's also being marketed for other uses still, ranging from Lyme disease to alcoholism to opioid addiction. So, as has happened historically many, many times and is often the case, enthusiasm and marketing and promotion can sometimes get a bit ahead of the evidence, and that's essentially where we're at with ketamine.
So marketing does not mean approved for. Is that correct?
Well, in this instance, that is correct. I mean, typically, manufacturers, drug companies are restricted to marketing and promoting their products only for FDA-approved indications. That's one of the ways that there are some guardrails placed around how companies can market and promote these drugs, or prescription drugs, I should say. But in the case of ketamine, you have the fact that the product is being marketed and promoted by clinics and by telehealth companies that aren't manufacturing the drug. And the laws and regulations that we have governing marketing and promotion were written in an era before the era of telemedicine and telehealth and these sort of stand-up clinics where it's not the drug manufacturer marketing ketamine, it's these other entities. And there's a patchwork of regulations governing what these other entities can and cannot say. But suffice it to say that if you look at the claims that are being made by them regarding the safety and effectiveness of ketamine, they range from sort of potentially misconstruing the evidence to being pants on fire, bald-faced lies. So there's been a lot of concern on the part of many people that have been watching this closely that there's this enormous loophole, essentially, and that we need to, update and revise the rules and regulations and laws governing pharmaceutical marketing and promotion so that it constrains the behavior of companies that currently are making outlandish claims about the safety and effectiveness of ketamine.
And what do we know about the safety and effectiveness of this drug as it's being used for, as you said, mental health issues?
Right. Well, unfortunately, far too little. The effectiveness. There are a lot of questions that remain about the effectiveness of ketamine, and I'm glad we're talking about both because really, when we, one of the pearls of the field of pharmacoepidemiology, which I practice, is that it's not just about safety or effectiveness; it's about safety and effectiveness and the balance of these. So when it comes to effectiveness, there is a remarkable dearth of evidence of well-controlled, randomized, blinded trials, which really represent the gold standard for how we assess effectiveness. So in most of these indications that I talked about, anxiety, PTSD, chronic pain, chronic non-cancer pain, let alone alcoholism, Lyme disease, opioid use disorder, there simply haven't been the trials done to demonstrate effectiveness. Doing trials with ketamine is hard. Many of the trials are not blinded. That is, there's no active comparator that obscures who really got the drug and who didn't, which raises concerns in terms of measurement. Many of the trials only look short-term, not long. They don't look at moderate or long-term outcomes of effectiveness. And the measures of effectiveness are often quite limited. And then we get to safety, which is really where things open up, because this is a drug that is ketamine that affects perception, hallucinations, visions, and such, mood. It can cause things ranging from euphoria to suicidality, affects behavior. and with a range of behaviors, sedation all the way to violence, and cognition, typically reducing, not enhancing cognition. And the real concern, the biggest concern, is that the effects aren't always short-lived, and the onset of these effects isn't always immediate. And so you have a drug that has unclear efficacy or unclear effectiveness with some very well-described dose response, cumulative adverse effects that are really non-trivial, and that, that run all the way up to fatality, death.
In these particular instances, how is ketamine being administered?
Well, another place where it's a bit of the wild, wild west. This is a drug that should be administered in highly controlled, highly supervised, structured clinical settings, and the FDA doesn't disagree with that. Now, they haven't gone out and tried to regulate ketamine using the same framework that they use for S-ketamine. But keep in mind, S-ketamine, this sort of newer cousin that was FDA approved in only a few years ago for the management of treatment refractory depression, it has one of the most strict risk mitigation programs of any drug that is FDA approved. So there's a huge number, more than 40 specific requirements that pharmacists and prescribers and patients have to meet in order to qualify for receiving S-ketamine. But then we come back to ketamine, this anesthetic that's been on the market since the 1960s, and it's being used in a lot of different settings. I mean, most concerning is that it's being used in non-healthcare settings. You can actually, in some places, get this drug compounded by a pharmacy for in-home use, which is really asking for trouble. But even short of that, the drug is also being used and delivered in cash-only clinics. These clinics can purchase a vial for less than $100 and charge $500 or $1,500 for an infusion. Insurers may not cover it, and the non-anesthesia uses aren't FDA approved. As we said, these are off-label, so it's a cash business. And then again, drug compounding adds extra uncertainty into the mix, and these compounders are loosely regulated. And the notion that you would use this as a nasal spray or something is just bonkers. I mean, if for no other reason, because you're home. But not only that, but also controlling the dose that you receive and really having any standardization of the exposure is very difficult when you're compounding. So it's a really risky setting.
Is there an addiction factor here?
Yeah, well, it definitely has a risk for non-medical use and for use disorder. So yes, I don't think we have the same level of evidence that we do with opioids, where we have many well-designed, rigorously developed and done studies that give us pretty solid numbers for how many people using opioids chronically may develop addiction. I don't think we're quite at that point, but there is a risk of addiction as well. So you have not only the potential unpredictable psychiatric effects that may have a delayed onset or may fail to clear rapidly, but you also have the potential for addiction and for non-medical use.
Given the loopholes in marketing, is there any impetus here to actually do the research that would be needed to see if there is some sort of efficacy here?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we talk about this a lot as I teach a course on drug utilization, when we discuss sort of when companies would or wouldn't have the incentive to do more research about products that they may be selling. And here, unfortunately, I mean, this is a good case study, right? Because you have a drug that's available for more or less pennies, and that is ketamine, not S-ketamine, but ketamine. There really is not the incentive necessarily for manufacturers to go out and do these studies, to say nothing of the challenges of doing the studies and doing them well. And I mean, even the FDA's approval of S-ketamine was fairly controversial. And for those interested in taking a look at that, there's some very well done critiques of the FDA's decision-making that really call into question whether that drug should even have been approved. So, yeah, unfortunately, there's not the incentives necessarily to get these studies done. But I think at a minimum, what we can do is, I mean, there's things that can be done on many different levels, but I think one of the most important is that we need to modernize the laws governing drug advertising. You know, these laws are enforced by overlapping authorities of the FDA and the Federal Trade Commission and a patchwork of state consumer protection statutes. But they, as I said, they were developed for an era long before the era of telemedicine and these pop-up clinics that are offering these drugs and marketing them with outlandish claims on the safety and effectiveness.
Given that there is an alternative, so to speak, to ketamine, you have S-ketamine, is there interest in using that to explore some of these other conditions as opposed to using ketamine?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know the degree to which S-ketamine is currently under serious clinical investigation for some of these other psychiatric indications. It would stand to reason that it might be. Certainly, the manufacturer would have an enormous incentive to seek additional label extensions. In other words, to identify and get FDA approval for other indications. And I suppose PTSD or possibly, severe generalized anxiety disorder might fit that bill as those sorts of indications. But I don't know the degree to which those are seriously understudied.
And last question for you. We also know that ketamine is used recreationally. People buy it, outside of these, licensed places. Yeah. And there may be a connection in some people's minds when they hear about mental health and the use of ketamine. And so for like self-medicating, can you talk about some of the risks there?
Yeah, well, I mean that you're right, and Special K. I think that ketamine has been a party drug for years, for decades, and recall the history that we talked about with ketamine being developed only after its earlier cousin PCP was abandoned because of the dissociative properties and the violence and aggression that was associated with PCP use and its potency. It was essentially a hard drug to manage. I think self-medication is risky. I think it's important that clinicians and patients are talking about this stuff. I mean, I'm not an impartial third party. I'm a practicing clinician, but I think that clinicians and patients should be talking about these things. And I think ketamine is a very, very dangerous drug is the bottom line. Again, efficacy, unclear, but the efficacy of a lot of things is unclear, but I'm not falling asleep worried about people taking turmeric. But this ain't no turmeric. And I think that this is it's a really potentially dangerous controlled substance with some very, very well described adverse effects and safety concerns. And we haven't discussed at all cardiovascular, urogenic, bladder, and so on and so forth. Neuropsychiatric, they go on and on. So I think anybody self-medicating with this is really taking some pretty big risks.
Caleb Alexander, thank you so much for returning to Public Health on Call.
Thanks for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Ceciri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Ceciri and Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.